I am Ashley Ferraro. I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Global Learning. I would now like to introduce Jason Scorza, Vice Provost of International Affairs at Fairleigh Dickinson University, to welcome our guest speaker.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully I am no longer muted. Somebody give me a thumbs up. Excellent. Well, those of you who are familiar with our long-running series, UN and NGO Pathways, will know that we'd like to have a wide variety of topics and guests. And I'm especially happy to be able to introduce our guest today, Sun-Young Yoon, who I have known, how long has it been now? 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. I feel we practically grew up together. Ms. Yoon is a very distinguished member of the UN NGO Committee. She has chaired the board of the Women's Environment Development Organization. She has been the UN representative for the International Alliance of Women. And if memory serves, you have also been on the board of Congo and also one of the officers. Is that right?
I was first vice president. I'm still on the board.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, you know your way around the UN, you know your way around international NGOs, and you know your way around the world. And the theme that we have chosen for today's program is one that we know is very dear to your heart. So I guess I can't ask everyone to offer you a warm welcome because that would be difficult. So instead, I'm going to turn over the program to Diana Cvitan, who is the Director of Global Learning and Global Partnerships at FDU. And she will explain to everyone how the program is going to run. And on with the show.
Great, thank you, Vice Provost, for that introduction there. So welcome everyone. We're so happy to have our virtual version of the forum that we are so proud to deliver on a regular basis. And for today's session, we will have a conversation. I'll be posing some questions to Dr. Yoon and for about 45 minutes. And then once we wrap that up, I'm going to turn to the audience and ask you to enter questions that you might have in the Zoom chat box. And we will do our best to address as many as we can in the time frame we have. And well, looking forward to a great conversation. So we'll get started. Thank you.
Sounds good.
So we heard a little bit of a background on your experiences with the UN, which are very broad and diverse in terms of the experiences. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about yourself and your work with the United Nations and really how you found your path along that way.
Yeah, I grew up in Michigan, although I was born in Korea. So at a very young age, at 2.5, I actually crossed borders already from North Korea to South Korea, and then from South Korea to the United States. And I think what I found as I was studying at the University of Michigan, I did French literature for a while because I really wanted to be in France. I thought it would be lots of fun. But then I realized that I could probably speak French pretty well after my junior year abroad. So I switched to anthropology because anthropology was my universe. It was all about different cultures. I could make reference to the whole world. And then when I graduated, I was teaching for a while. I taught at Eastern Michigan University. I taught at the residential college at University of Michigan, looking for different ways of teaching. But I felt as though something was missing from the connection between the university and change. And so then I realized I couldn't stay in academia in the US. So I packed up my bags and went back to South Korea. I don't speak Korean that well. So I had to learn Korean. I got a Fulbright scholarship, went back, and was able to teach at Ewha Women's University for a couple of years. And from the university, UNICEF asked me to travel around the country with some teams and do some evaluations. And eventually my name popped up for the regional office in Southeast Asia in Thailand to work as a social scientist for UNICEF. For me, it was like, as an anthropologist, it was a dream come true because I could learn so much. But then there was also that possibility of actually applying what I learned on the ground. So that was exciting for me. So then for UNICEF, I also worked with the World Health Organization in the Southeast Asia regional office. In Delhi, we covered 11 countries. North Korea actually is a member state of that office. And yeah, I have, my LinkedIn profile says I work for the UN and sometimes I get paid. So, switching over to the NGO side is a natural part for my work for the UN.
Great. Thank you so much for that background. And you've had quite a bit of work on women's rights and women's issues in the varied contexts. And so, you know, it's very interesting. FDU community has been very engaged in the Commission on the Status of Women over the past few years. And we were sad in that that had to be canceled this year, and understandably. It's such a wonderful event. Yeah. And along with all of the events that the NGO, CSWNY coordinated, where does that leave us in terms of women's rights at the UN and engagement on these issues?
Yeah, if you don't mind, you know, we're going to have a conversation on this.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious to know what it is you were planning to do.
Well, we've had different levels of engagement. We've had a great turnout from our students who have volunteered last year. And Ashley, please, Ashley, join in and give me the number. I think we had close to 70 volunteers.
Amazing.
Yeah.
We count on your
about
volunteers.
Yeah.
And were you going to host side events?
Well, we had faculty engaged as well. We had been in discussion about organizing a side event. Nothing had been set yet, unfortunately, but yeah, with the turn of events, it made it obviously not possible at this point.
Right, so you go there as participants. Is it part of the students' curriculum to attend? I mean, I saw here that students are getting credit, so do they get credit for actually attending CSW?
They do in some ways. It is closely linked with a number of courses. It tends to be a bit more of a co-curricular activity, though some faculty will incorporate it very explicitly within the curriculum of the course. And we had students from all disciplines, from nursing, from political science, from biological sciences. It's really a varied group of faculty and students represented. So, you know, in recent years, we've really built a strong interest. So, you know, we felt it having, you know, not losing the opportunity to engage in that this year.
Well, you know, it fits with my idea that in many ways, UN conferences, which are often dismissed as not producing anything, are intense learning places, especially on the NGO side, but also inside the UN. So I think, you know, attaching it to learning and to education makes total sense. What I wanted to say about the CSW is to put it really in perspective. The Commission on the Status of Women, as you know, within the UN system is a commission, not a development agency. So commissions are there under Economic Social Council to monitor what is happening and to provide recommendations to member states and often also to NGOs on the future direction. So the Commission on the Status of Women specific mandate is to monitor those world conferences that took place. So there were 4 of them: Mexico, Nairobi, Copenhagen, and Beijing. That Beijing Platform for Action, which happened 25 years ago, is by and agreed upon by 189 states, has been the recurring theme of the CSW. That said, since the UN began and since those world conferences started, really tremendous effort has been made to mainstream women's issues into the entire UN system. So one of my jobs for UNICEF was to actually monitor and evaluate projects for UNICEF from that perspective. So I would go into the field, for example, in Indonesia to a health project, and they would say, okay, let's see if you can help us evaluate what women are doing in this particular health project in maternal child health. And then as an anthropologist, my job was to go in and interview the women, interview the doctors, interview the healthcare workers. In that situation, primary health care, it's a lot of trekking through mud and a lot of eating very strange foods, at least strange to me, but that's what anthropologists do. And that was the kind of thing I did for UNICEF. And so UNICEF itself, as it deals with children, it also deals with women and children. So I wanted to make clear that development organizations like UNICEF have integrated women's issues there. Another one that's really very strong in the field is UNFPA, that deals with population. And they're the ones in refugee camps providing health services, for example, specifically for women's sexual reproductive health and rights. So there's that. And WHO has a very strong gender unit. I still work some with them on women in tobacco, women in non-communicable diseases. And so that's mainstreamed a lot into all of the things that WHO is doing, including the current COVID-19 pandemic. So that's one thing. For the students, what I wanted to tell you is that there are other places in the UN, in New York, where students could be really actively engaged. One of them is the High Level Political Forum, which takes place in July every year, which I think this year will probably be very virtual. But we have what we call the 9 major groups. And one of them is the Women's Major Group, but there's another one called the NGO Major Group. Faculty could get involved with the academics. There's an academic, professional major group. And I'm active in the NGO Major Group and the Women's Major Group. And we produce position papers together. That is something that you can sign up for online. You can get the communications. You can participate virtually with these groups and get to know other NGOs from around the world who are interested in those particular interest areas related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Do you have any questions about that one? Because I have lots more.
Yeah, no, please continue. I mean, these are wonderful examples.
Okay, so that's July. So if you missed March, you can always hit July. In the winter, what I'm very involved in is with the Women's Environment Development Organization. We along with a few other NGOs convene something called the Gender Climate Constituency, the GCC. The Gender Climate Constituency is, again, an open forum, but we gather the women's groups around the climate change negotiations. We actually do training for government delegates at that particular event, but every morning there is a gathering of the NGOs who showed up. They talk about the negotiations, what's coming up, what they can do with their governments. And last year, there was a very important event that was not much publicized, but which is important in the UN system. The UNFCCC, Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the official body, actually officially passed a gender action plan within which delegates and the Secretariat and member states are required to report on the number of women who are in the delegations in the negotiations, for example. I think it's the only UN treaty body that has actually brought that officially into their records. And it supports women's human rights approach to climate change. So that is another area in which women's influence and through the NGO side has really made a difference. And again, that's an open space. So if by next year it's in Glasgow, well, this year it's in Glasgow. I have a feeling that also will be postponed, but follow it online, follow whatever, you know, you can online with, if you come to our website, WeDo's website, you will see references to what's happening there at the negotiations. And the other one I wanted to mention is Habitat. Habitat, WeDo sits on the steering committee of a group called the World Urban Campaign, which is an NGO counterpart to Habitat. UN Habitat is the organization within the UN system responsible for urban affairs. Now, if you're interested in climate change, you're interested in what's happening and who's managing this health situation now, or what's happening in business, you really need to pay attention to city leadership. So we decided that we needed to be there with women's issues as well. So we've been working very closely with the gender unit of Habitat. And this World Urban Campaign is actually more than just the women's constituency. It's really a lot of NGOs. I love working with that group because we have architects there, a lot of urban planners, really smart people who get together and provide civil society input. Any questions?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, the connections. I wonder if you could say a bit more. I mean, something that's intriguing to me is that connection with between the environment and gender and women's issues. I wonder if you could say a bit more about what's being done, what's being investigated on that side.
Yeah, I have to say that like in a lot of things in health, we don't have enough data to actually track things that we want to track. But we have some data from Oxfam and a few other places on what happens to women during climate disaster, for example. Disaster risk and the difficulties that are imposed particularly on women. I'll give you an example, land. You know, there's something like 2% of the world's land is actually owned by women. And yet they produce most of the food in Africa. And yet they're the ones, when men leave their villages for the city because of climate change and natural disasters, they're left having to make decisions about land, but they don't have control over the land. So actually the point that we want to make is that if you don't give women decision-making power over resources that they need to manage biodiversity, to manage their ecologies, to manage food production and food security, you're actually losing as a society as a whole. And it has many ramifications in terms of poverty outcomes and of the possibilities of the next generation to thrive. So that's one part of it. So the so-called vulnerability of women because they do not control the resources that you need to deal with adaptation. The other thing on mitigation, I think is interesting on the more positive side, women are really at the heart of a lot of energy decisions, household appliances, for example, in the industrialized world. So there is a very proactive role which women need to play in energy consumption, in choices. Are we going to get an electric car, or are we going to not get an electric car? Those are the kinds of things in which we can have influence, which we don't always think of in terms of climate change. The last point I want to make for students is when people ask me what young women can do, actually youth in general, about climate change, I have one single answer, which is vote. Like health, climate change is not a scientific issue alone. It's a political issue. It's being driven or not driven, or we're going to succeed or we're going to fail because of politics. Because the science is there, people are not listening to it. And you get the analogy, of course, to today, what's happening with the health pandemic. The science is there, but the politics are screwing it up. So vote. be an informed voter, do a voter registration drive, and get young women to vote, and get people who can actually vote to vote. 18-year-old, my nephew's son does not vote, and he can because he's in high school and he thinks he's too young to vote.
Yeah. Well, you raise a very important point, I think, for our youth engagement. And I think your examples were really a splendid way of demonstrating the interconnectedness of the Sustainable Development Goals, how all of those issues are tied. So thank you for that. I'd like to move to a topic that seems to be dear to your heart. It's tied to a TEDx talk that you had given. And you have it's a great talk. I recommend our audience maybe look it up on YouTube when we're done. It's titled "How to Peel an Onion Without Crying." And I was hoping you could, for those who might be thinking that we're going to give a culinary lesson here,
Exactly.
I was hoping that you could maybe explain what is meant by this concept of a peeled onion.
Peeled onion is a metaphor. I'm sure that psychologists have all kinds of better explanations than I do, but I couldn't help but think of this metaphor of the peeled onion when I was thinking retrospectively of my journey, my personal journey, as being a North Korean who traveled to the US, who then worked as a, with a UN passport, traveling all over, and being constantly confronted with the idea that I had to redefine my identity in so many different cultural situations. So I wanted to share that with young people. And if I can just start with what I see happening in life. Again, I'm sure psychologists have a better way of saying this than I do, but what I saw, is that when you're born, you're given a name. That is your first identity, is your name. In Korea, names have meanings. For example, Sunyoung, my particular set of Chinese characters, means peace forever because I was named during war. So you grow up you're given this name, right? So for sure, that is your first identity and you have nothing to say about it. So then I saw growing up as being a process from which you begin to make decisions and get yourself in situations where you become more and more in charge of your identity. That's kind of like what growing up is, right? So then on top of your name, you add another identity. Oh, I'm a really good athlete, right? So then that becomes your prime pride. And so whenever possible, that identity comes forward in a conversation with other young people. Or musician. My family is a family of musicians. And at some point, I became known as a pianist. So that became a really important part of my personal identity. So weaning yourself away from identities that are given to you by parents, by other people, eventually you begin to grapple with who is the real me, right? I think some people call it adolescence. But not all cultures have adolescence. In not all cultures do people have to struggle with that. But in a highly individualistic culture, like in the United States, you have to take that responsibility yourself to a great extent. So I think that's why adolescence becomes a very difficult time sometimes. So then eventually, you transition out and you just find that you have more and more layers. You're a particular ethnic group that suddenly becomes important because you want to dress like them. Or, you decide you're not that ethnic group and you decide you're a global citizen. So you really explore all the possibilities of clothing, of food, everything. So what's interesting to me is that there are some consistencies that happen in adding layers and layers of identity. One of them, of course, is your name. And the other one for this particular group that's very relevant is the identity of student. For a very, very long time, up until now, you have been known as a student. So when you meet someone, they'll say, you know, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a student at, and you give the name of the institution. So at this point in your lives, when you're really have that identity for a very long time, I think it feels very stable because it's a very long part. Proportionally to one's lifetime, it's very short. It's a very short period of time. And at some point, they're going to kick you out the door, whether you want to be there or not. And you're in the big world where that no longer is there as your identity, and something else happens. That my point is, you just keep going and going and going.
So from your description, it seems that one can add layers through life, but then also remove layers as well. There's kind of that back and forth depending on how the person builds his or her identity.
You know, I see it in the women's movement, actually. So I was one of the organizers of that NGO forum in China 25 years ago, when we saw, you know, 30,000 really crazy women and men, boys and girls, children, you know, babies on the back, show up in Huairu in China. And we created tents. And I remember walking into the peace tent one day, and I even have a picture of this, and seeing these women dancing the hokey pokey. And there was one group of American women who were teaching all of these other women how to dance the hokey pokey. Now, that's actually very easy to do because you just imitate someone. But these women couldn't speak to each other. They didn't know each other's language. They were of all different ages and even levels of disability. And yet there they were, hand in hand. In my metaphor, they had peeled away all other identities of nationality, of age, of disability, and suddenly they were just women. I think that gives you a sense of not being alone. Because when you have other identities and you bring them forward, you often then are in subgroups. But when you peel away all those identities in situations like that, you suddenly realize that you're all the same. And that was what people tell me was the magic of actually being there in that tent, dancing the hokey pokey.
That's an interesting example. It makes me think of a universal identity of global citizenship.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your thoughts are on redefining yourself through life and embracing global citizenship. How do you define global citizenship? Does it require an individual to peel away and give away their layers, or can they keep the layers of their onion and still be a global citizen?
Well, the truth is you can do lots of things. Let me just start with the idea that, yeah, if you peel away the layer of nationality, of ethnicity, of religion, of age, and suddenly you become a woman, you can also peel away gender. So if you peel away gender, you end up being a human being. And if you see yourself properly, as we are in a community of life with animals, with plants, with earth, then you even expand your sense even more. So for me, a global citizen has to do that. They have to understand that connection with other human beings, but also to be truly global and not just humanist, you need to connect yourself with the community of life. So I think that is something which happens in different ways, in different times to different people. What I want to say about that is that that's why you don't cry. It's really a joyful experience to do that. And I think those of you who have worked in the UN, who have seen it accomplish something that you have contributed to, I think you would get that sense of being part of that global community of life. And it is certainly worth looking for that and making sure it stays the core part of what you do with your life. And having said that, if I could just add one more thing, which I've observed, which is the whole area of mistaken identity, which I experienced a lot in my lifetime. If I travel to Thailand, they think I'm Thai. If I travel to France, they think I'm Vietnamese. The only place in the world where I've ever been identified as originally from North Korea was in Czechoslovakia, because it turned out that at some point in Czechoslovakia, there were a bunch of students from North Korea who studied there. But mistaken identity is really an interesting phenomenon as well, I think, because you have these layers of identity, but then you're not always entirely in control. So the point is, you actually live in a society where other people are telling you what you are, right? And I think that's the challenge and the struggle you were talking about, through a lifetime, how it works. I feel that a global citizen has the responsibility not to give someone else a mistaken identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very interesting point. So often we think of identity and global citizenship about the individual choice, but it's also about that interaction with others.
It is, definitely. And that is the definition of racism. So you look at someone else by the color of their skin, rather than who that person is. That person is probably type B blood type, just like you. And yet you don't identify that commonality with that person. I think a global citizen always looks for that commonality. They meet someone new, they don't understand them, they have no idea why they're behaving the way they are, but you look for that commonality to see if there is a common ground for understanding. And for me, so much of the prejudice that we see in the world are people imposing on other people the wrong identity.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. I'm wondering, thinking about going with this idea of global citizenship and that identity, how do you think challenging times such as those now that we're living through impact the idea, the concept, and the development of a global citizen identity in individuals? Do the challenges foster that growth? Can they inhibit it? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that's an interesting question. Obviously, that idea of identifying with a world problem rather than your own problem, which is what a global citizen does. How do my decisions impact the world as opposed to just me? Is at the core of our political problems. So obviously, I think that it's much better to have that expanded consciousness, that awareness, a knowledge base that allows you to connect to the rest of the world. But what I would like to say, can I talk a little bit about work?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that I wanted to communicate to this group, I don't know how many of you are seniors or ready to not be students anymore, but I wanted to talk a little bit about work, because some people think that to be a global responsible citizen, you have to work for the UN, you have to travel to Africa, you have to be out there. To me, you could be driving, I think calls them buoys or zambonis or something, in an ice skating rink and clearing the ice skating rink, and still be a global citizen. Because what I find is that when people step out of the university and go into the work world, their identities are much too closely tied to their work, to their job, right? The title they have on their job, climbing up in their job becomes an important part of their sense of self-worth as a person. I think that is a huge error, because it turns out to be self-destructive. So when you transition out from being a student into an environment which is going to be very difficult if you're doing it this year in finding a job, my advice is do not let whatever job you get into define who you are. I think that's really important. And I make a distinction between job and work. Like women do it all the time. So we have work, which is largely unpaid, which is extremely important. A lot of it around the world has to do with care of sick people, of children, of keeping the household ecology smoothly run, people fed. That is work. And it should be valued more than it is, even by economists. But a woman can also feel that worth if the people around her tell her that is really a very important job that you're doing. We need to do that. And she may be a nanny in another household or be doing housework for someone else, which in many societies, for whatever reason, is considered unskilled and not as good a job as working in a bank or behind the desk. So whatever job you end up having as your first job, I would say do not let it define your identity.
That's some really, really good advice.
Is it good advice? Yeah. Did you get that advice when you graduated?
No, I got advice, just find a job, any job.
Yeah.
So I kind of graduated into a recession as well. So
I think it's going to happen to a lot of people. And even if we didn't begin that way, we certainly have to expect that in our lifetimes, our economies are going to change. My daughter went to Wellesley, and at some point, you know, they just couldn't find the jobs. They ended up, you know, doing real estate or something like that. Her friends couldn't find the jobs that they really thought that they had been preparing for in their entire education, and yet they had such a good sense of self-worth, you know, that they went through it. And I was telling my husband this morning, you know, that I've done jobs just for the adventure, to see what it's like to be on that other side, you know, sweeping the streets or whatever. And you can have that attitude towards a job that is not your ideal job, but which is a learning place. In any case, you're learning about other people who do those jobs. And the biggest mistake we can make in that situation is to devalue their worth.
mhm. Yeah, it seems like there's an approach to building the layers of your professional identity as well in what you're saying, right?
Yes,
So taking
there is.
experiences and building those layers as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wonder what advice you have in that regard for the students, managing and transitioning between those different layers of identity, whether it be personal, professional, and balancing those. You had some very good words on just recognizing the worth of anything that's done.
Yeah.
What else can students do? How can they balance those transitions?
I don't know about balancing. I think it's really important to lean on others. Again, because this particular US American society I see is so individualistic, you often don't share that you're having trouble. You know, I think that's why in social movements are so wonderful, women's movement, you know, we feel as though we can approach another woman at CSW and tell her our problems, and she or he are going to sympathize, right? So that's the beauty of that kind of space. So I think leaning on others is really a great way to get through something that's a difficult time. I think also on the positive side, I think the attitude of being adventurous is really fun, important. Be adventurous, seek new identities in new places, in new spaces, something that you've not thought of doing. If you're a student now, why not also become a teacher once in a while as a volunteer? Join the Peace the Teachers for America or something like that at some point. I think it's really great at the early stages after graduation to not get stuck in a particular place. There is, of course, the thing about student loan debt and the need to survive, but one makes choices, balanced choices between something that looks like a secure path financially and those which might be more learning paths for your life. And I think those are always very, very difficult decisions to make. But I would say try to maintain that attitude of finding new experiences and new identities.
Great. I was wondering if you could perhaps share an example. You mentioned finding adventures and pursuing these opportunities, not knowing where they might lead, but often they provide real growth opportunities and open doors. I wonder if you could give an example of one of the opportunities you might have selected in life that served as a real adventure, not knowing where to go, and it provided the kind of opportunity that built and continued.
Marriage. Really, I mean, think about it. That's a huge leap for anyone. Marriage, I have no idea how men think, so get married. See what happens. No, I'm semi-serious about that. Besides the incident I just mentioned, which is packing up my bags, getting a Fulbright, and taking off for a country whose language I did not speak, and expect that I would teach there in Korea. Actually, that was my first big adventure. I just said, I need to start something different, new. But there are personal adventures as well. And getting married is one of them.
Yeah.
And it's been many, many years now. And I'm learning more and more about men.
Oh, that's wonderful. Certainly the professional and the personal are connected. We're one person, so.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, I think this is a great point, unless you'd like to share any other thoughts with the students, the audience. We have faculty participating as well. I was going to open it up to questions and ask, I see that we have some questions. So let me see if you'd like, we can get started.
Yeah, if you could read them for me, it would be easier.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the first one, let's see. Nicholas asks about I believe about you being misidentified in the international setting,
Excuse me.
and if that happens in a potentially dangerous situation, like you speak about in the TED Talk, perhaps there was that example where it was a bit tenuous there. How is it that you gain back control? And if you can touch upon the dangers of being a global citizen and how to move around these dangers so you can still make change in this world.
Yeah, I think there are two kinds of danger. There's a danger of letting it affect you and becoming fearful. And then there's the actual danger. So the incident the student was talking about, is it David?
The student, Nicholas.
Nicholas, okay. So Nicholas, the incident you were talking about on the Syrian border, where I was suddenly surrounded with guns, and they told me to get out of the car. My passport was fake, that I was Egyptian terrorist. They were about to arrest me, take me into custody. That's a physical danger. The way I coped with that is I got really mad. I got really angry. And I was with a Palestinian couple who happened to be, the man happened to be an officer in the Jordanian army. So the way we got out of that is he called his superiors, and they eventually, after almost half a day, they came and rescued us from that situation. I could have probably become very fearful about ever going to Syria again, but I was given some kind of armor where I am not prone to be a fearful person. And so when I remember that incident, you can see me smiling about it. To me, it ended up being something that I could live through. So I think difficulty depends very much on your emotional state. You know, you could very easily be frightened by the smallest thing, by the smallest setback, or you could dismiss it as being not that important to your emotional makeup, if that makes sense. In other situations, yeah, I've been in many dangerous situations, like going to the airport and suddenly having the Thai army show up at the airport with tanks because they were in a coup. Or I was in Burma for UNICEF when suddenly they said, you know, the young army has come and there's going to be a military coup d'etat. So we were in the Ministry of Health near the windows, and they said, you have to move away from the windows because they're breaking the windows of all the government buildings. So we moved to the back of the building, and then we heard we heard shouting outside, and what the young army people were shouting is, don't hit that building, that's the Ministry of Health, they're saving our soldiers. So we felt much better about that. But again, for whatever reason, it was not fear. I ended up going back to Burma. I was in Burkina Faso again with another coup d'etat. There was a rumor in the offices that I was causing these coup d'etats because every country I went to, there would be some army that came into the airport or capital shortly afterwards. But as someone who works for the UN in the field, I have to say that it is a dangerous occupation in the sense that you need to be prepared for these kinds of situations, or even disease situations. I have been very sick from the kind of exposures that I've had to different diseases in different situations. And you have to be prepared for that if you're going to actually, you know, be out there in the field as part of the work. I think it goes with the job.
Continuing on with your experiences at the UN, Alanis asked about your most rewarding or most impactful experiences while working at the UN. What did you find to be a most rewarding experience?
It's like asking me, what is my favorite dish of food? You know, I love it all. I really love it all. I think the most impactful thing was working for WHO on the women and tobacco process. So I was responsible for organizing a meeting in Kobe, Japan. And this was a very high-level meeting. It was going to be the launch of the first public health treaty called the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Dr. Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway, was then Director General, came. She met the Emperor just before our meeting, and we had gathered together leaders of the feminist women's movement, along with top scientists on tobacco control and politicians, mayors. So we had all these people together. And out of that conference began the process of creating this WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is responsible, unbeknownst to most people, for smoke-free New York City, for smoke-free Ireland, for smoke-free France. So we set the standard of legislation in that legally binding treaty, which allowed the governments to change their legislation for smoke-free place, to raise prices, taxation, which discouraged youth smoking, and which helped a lot of women quit.
Yeah, certainly that was an impactful experience, given all of those examples. Wow.
Yeah, and it continues today to be really important standard. I mean, the UN's job in treaty processes is to set a legislative standard. It doesn't mean it's the ceiling. It's usually what we call the floor, which means you start there. But it is one of the wonderful things that the UN has done. Law of the Sea, you know, Geneva Convention, CEDAW for women's rights, and something like this.
Mhm. Thanks. We have a few questions tied to work. So the theme of jobs and work. We have one from Terrence that asks about recommendations and solutions to help gain jobs in the future. So where is world of work going? And then also tied to that, my colleague Senna was curious to know what barriers you felt women faced in developing careers across their work lives. And do you think culture plays a role? She's originally from Syria and would love you to visit again with her. So
In the same border.
an open invitation to return. Yeah.
That's a lot of packaging into one little place.
Yeah.
The world of work. I've been always going back to the theme, as I said, of not letting that. I don't call it work. I call it job. You know, the job place, the job market. If you want to work for the UN, I have a very specific recommendation, which is you must know another language. If you don't know it now, it's really important to master it. You have to at least have that sense of being able to step into the shoes, say our Syrian friend here. You know, if she speaks Arabic, it's a great place to start because then you can actually understand that point of view. And as a French major, I feel as though I understand France more because I can get inside the language. And those UN languages are extremely useful preparation for international jobs. And what was the other?
Well, the theme of work of the future, where tips and ideas for preparing and pursuing opportunities, and then also considering barriers for women. Are there barriers that women face in their careers? So in a long-term picture of growth in a career for women.
Yeah, of course we do. I mean, of course we do. We always have to be better in politics, better, more qualified. You know, it's becoming perhaps less and less so depending on which culture you're in. But to this day, you know, my friend Surya Obaid from Saudi Arabia was former head of UNFPA, was, I believe, the first woman in Saudi Arabia to appear in the newspaper without her cover on. So we still have those things happening around us all the time. What I find in the international world of social media and the communications that we have is that we're learning faster from each other how to do things. So I think actually we have a great advantage in communications because we're not like feeling like we're alone anymore. We know that if you really want to make it, even in the UN, having an advanced degree more than your peers is really a plus. And you know that because you're in a community. I belong to a community of women who work for the UN or formerly work for the UN. You can consult with each other and help each other through some of those their barriers are personal. So if you consider it a barrier, you know, then you need to share it and to bring other people into that conversation to help you.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel, Alejandra asked about your experience having come from another country? I think you immigrated very, very young as a small child, if I'm correct. Do you feel that served as any obstacle for you, or was it anything within your identity that served as an obstacle for you as you went through your career?
Well, actually, it probably was. I just am too dumb to know it was. I mean, really, I told you I had this kind of armor, this kind of blindness to some extent to some of this. I think it was given that by my parents. I think as parents, they give you that kind of armor sometimes. And my parents gave me this armor that, you know, the only burden I used to feel was the burden of my country, because my aunt told me since I was very young, we lived with her for a while, she said, you know, everything you do, people are going to judge your country from what you do. Because in Michigan, where I grew up, you know, there were Asians, of course, around, but when you're of a minority group in this country, as opposed to in Korea, and I have to say that my husband, who is my biological opposite, blonde and tall, when he's in Korea, the same thing happens. What he does, you know, they judge America by. So when I would do things or not do things, I was always aware that I was probably reflecting my culture and my country. And that's a good thing and a difficult thing, I think, for a child to grow up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is it a burden to be regarded as the ambassador or the representative of your identity?
I feel important. I mean,
yeah.
Nothing else, you know, like, oh, right, yeah, it's me, yeah.
That's a great way to look at it. As someone, Danielle asks, as someone who has traveled and worked in many places, what do you see as the #1 recurring problem that women face? Is there a kind of a universal challenge that women face? And is there a way that problem can be alleviated? Is it on the track to being solved?
Well, Danielle, it has little to do with my travel. It probably has more to do with what I see in research and in the studies and so on, but no one could walk away from violence against women. As a health issue, as a crime issue, something that is seen in every country, from the poorest people to the richest class. It happens. And it is something that we struggle with. It is at the very, very heart, I think, of what makes everyone angry, including men. Men get angry when their daughters and their wives are assaulted. So how do we deal with that? I myself think that we need much more health research on masculinities. And I think that we need to take the responsibility for solving this problem to some extent, to share it more with men, so that the 80% of men who are not perpetrators should be responsible for protecting, researching, finding out solutions to how to deal with the minority of men who are continually getting away with mental violence, actual violence, and threats of violence.
Yeah, so I'm serious. Have you seen any models that have been employed or examples where there have been real successful progress in addressing that issue?
Well, that's a good question too. I mean, I wish that one could find something on a big scale. I'm sure that we could find them on smaller community scales, and that in many cases, like in Vietnam, I know men have taken the responsibility and dealt with it, you know, in their own communities. That what we're not seeing is on the national. And so even something like White Ribbon Campaign, for example, which works very well with young men who are perpetrators, bring them in, for them, try to, etc. They're reporting that they don't have long-term solutions for these men. And the reason is because the national framework, the policies, the criminal codes, etc., do not support what the NGOs are trying to do. So we really need to find, I think maybe Iceland, maybe we can look there to see what they're trying to do. But you have, as I say, it crosses all cultures, all races, all classes. This is happening, and it's bad for men. It's certainly bad for us.
Yeah. So certainly much work to be done on that front. Well, I see that we're out of time, so I'm going to have to. Hopefully, we got to most of the questions that were there, and I will thank you very much, Dr. Yoon, for a wonderful discussion. I'll turn it over to.
Can I do a plug, a final
please
plug?
Do.
Okay, so my WHO colleagues sent me a message this morning saying that on Saturday, Lady Gaga is going to do a benefit
Wow.
for the health workers of the world and for WHO. And it's going to be on NBC and ABC at 8 o'clock, I think, on Saturday night. So if you go on, I'll send you the link to the website.
I have it, yes.
Yeah, and if you would share it with the group,
I'll share it with everybody.
that would be great, Ashley. And then they can sign up and be a part of this community that's being a part of this global effort.
Yeah, it looks like a wonderful event, so I'll share it with everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Dr. Yoon, thank you for taking the time. You hit some very important points. Any questions that you think of that you weren't able to ask, please feel free to send them over to me, and I will send them over to Dr. Yoon. And again, thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks a lot. Yeah,
Bye.
really,
Thanks again.
really enjoyed this event. Thanks.